Thank you, Hilarie, and good afternoon to all of you. I can't tell you how delighted that Professor Redfield and I are to have received the invitation to be here with you this afternoon to talk about this really critical topic. Professor Redfield is over at the table with the computer, so this is an integrated presentation, and I'm standing up here, but I assure you she is really the muscle behind what we're going to do today. Before she speaks, I want to, as I said, thank President Bass for that generous introduction and for your friendship of so many years. There are a lot of people in here who are friends of longstanding. I can't call all the names, but I must acknowledge the immediate past chair and my friend, Sandy Weinberg, who is an incredible lawyer here and has done so much in the space of criminal justice and has really supported our work, the work that we will be doing, which is producing a phase 2 and talking about this topic hopefully around the country. So I thank him. And I want to thank all of the judges who are here. As I said before, it's dangerous to start calling names, so I won't do that, but I have to acknowledge Sandy Weinberg and his wife Rosemary, who's going to get an award from the criminal justice section. So I want to let Professor Redfield greet you, and then we'll get started. Professor Redfield.
Hi, everybody. So the heavy muscle work is to push this key and advance the slides. And unfortunately, despite hours spent this morning trying to get this to work, it's going to take a few keys before I can get to it.
Hi, what's your name, darling?
My name is Susan Boyle.
Okay, Susan, and where are you from?
I am from Blackburn near Bathgate, West Lothian.
It's a big town.
It's a sort of collection of, villages. Had to think there.
And how old are you, Susan?
I am 47. And that's just one side of me.
Okay, what's the dream?
I'm trying to be a professional singer.
And why hasn't it worked out so far, Susan?
I've never been given the chance before, but here's hoping it'll change.
Okay, and who would you like to be as successful as?
Elaine Page.
Elaine Page.
Like
What are you going to sing tonight?
I'm going to sing I Dreamed a Dream from the Miserables.
Okay.
Big song.
Yeah? Yes.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by, when folks smiled, eyes were fading.
You didn't expect that, did you? Did you? No.
I dreamed that love would never die. I dreamed that God would be forgiving. I was young and unafraid. When
All right. Thank you very much, Susan. Piers.
Without a doubt, that was the biggest surprise I have had in 3 years on this show. When you stood there with that cheeky grin and said, I want to be like Elaine Page, everyone was laughing at you. No one is laughing now. That was stunning. An incredible performance. Amazing. I'm reeling from shock. How about you two? But
I am
Can't believe
so
it.
thrilled because I know that everybody was against you. I honestly think that we were all being very cynical, and I think that's the biggest wake-up call ever. And I just want to say that it was a complete privilege listening to that. It was brilliant.
Susan, I knew the minute you walked out on that stage that we were going to hear something extraordinary, and I was right.
Not a lot of touch.
Susan, you are a little tiger, aren't you?
Oh, I don't know about that.
You
I don't know about
are.
that.
Okay, moment of truth. Here's yes or no.
the biggest yes I have ever given anybody.
Amanda?
Yes, definitely. Brilliant.
Susan Boyle, you can go back to the village with your head held high. It's 3 yeses.
And so think about what you saw there.
Thank you.
The person who steps on stage, who wants to be a singer, does not fit the stereotype of what we have in our mind as a singer. We would normally think of a singer as somebody probably younger, with a little bit, I suppose, more contemporary hairstyle. Probably,
Not so frumpy is the way I put
well,
it.
I wasn't going to use
Yeah,
something because
okay.
I just, but okay, since you did, that's
I did, yeah, right.
I'm not sure, you know, under the canons, I could just get away with it. But anyway, she did fit the stereotype. And as Hilarie said before, so many times, those first impressions can really evoke things, and we can make decisions and take actions, because many times a person does not have an opportunity to go to that next level and demonstrate or rebut that stereotype as you had here. The person who doesn't get an opportunity to display the range of their skills. So I think that shows us sort of the danger of those first impressions.
So I think if we had asked the judges here ahead of time whether they judged every performer fairly based on just their talent, I think they probably would have said yes. But you saw them change their minds, right? We all saw them. And I think that's what Hilarie was talking about in her remarks, that we make responses that were not really consistent with what we actually truly in our hearts think we're doing. So there's just a little bit of introduction now. We like to start with that film clip, even though I didn't have the technology quite right. I like to start with the film clip just to get people to see in something apart from our own worlds what this bias can look like and how it can change. But this is more of our regular introduction. And so I want to start by saying a couple things. We value your expertise. There'll be times for you to contribute and some discussion at the end. And we consider your expertise at least as good as ours, and we value it. The second is we really want to be clear there's no blame here. We did not come here to call anybody a racist, a sexist, any other kind of ist, or whatever words they now end in now, but to try and understand how we might be responding with feelings we have that we don't consciously agree with.
Yeah, we like to say that we don't do shame and blame. Mm-hmm. It's really about education and awareness, training, and really meeting people where they are, but getting at the science behind what we're trying to impart.
So we want you to leave here reflecting a little bit about what you saw. We have here that nothing's recorded, but we were persuaded by the heavy hand of the Florida bar folks to allow some parts of this to be recorded, but not the discussion parts. Okay, so we want you to feel that whatever you say in conversation isn't going anywhere. So I'm a law professor, so I have to tell you about the citations. There's one on every slide, and if there aren't enough, you just call me, okay? And I'm also a law professor, used to having students complain that I'm going too fast or I skipped a slide, but we have a limited time. And so we want to be clear that what we're doing is a presentation to introduce some concepts. It's not training, it's not meant to be training, but we want you to get some ideas and walk away with a few new skills. And our names are all over everything, so call us and get more.
Okay, so there are many instances when implicit bias might be at play and we're not aware of it. So I would ask the question, might you have implicit biases? Separate and apart from what Hilarie said, and I think might you be aware of them, and if you aren't sure whether you have them or not, how can you find out? Or why bother to concern yourself with this? Well, I think there are a lot of good reasons, a million good reasons about how you find out. And then the other thing is, if you find out you have them, how can you disrupt biases? We want to give you some homework too as a part of this presentation. So as I started to say earlier, there are many manifestations of disproportionality and inequality in every juncture of society. They're in education, they're in law, they're in the judiciary, they're in Congress, they're all over the place. And we want to get at some of this today. We asked a question before, might you have implicit biases? I think the answer is yes. And I can say that with confidence because we all have them. I want to get at one other thing right quick. Oftentimes when we think about bias, we often go to the negative. But biases can be negative or they can be positive because bias really is a preference. And so we express them, and our training is going to get at getting rid of some of those negative ones, but you'll also hear something about some of the ones that people might look at as positive. So let's look at some of those. In talking about the many manifestations and unexplained disproportionalities, everyone in here would say that I am fair and impartial. I approach the work that I do in a fair and impartial manner. But many of the areas where these things come to play are in, as Hilarie mentioned before, diversity. I have to give an aside right now. There was a friend of mine whose name I can't remember right now, but she was active in the American Bar Association. She was the first woman judge in the state of Maine. And she was a friend. I mean, I think she was elected or appointed in 1972. Her first name was Harriet, but I can't remember the last name. And then the first woman judge in Tennessee was in 1977. Yeah, there were women in law, but you didn't have women ascend to the judiciary. So areas like diversity in judges, in jurors, because we know for a time women couldn't serve on juries, other times people of color couldn't serve. In employment, there's still jobs that are looked at as being jobs that are really relegated to men. There were some that were relegated to women. I mean, we remember the push that men had to make to become flight attendants, court personnel, police, and you can see them in other activities that are reflected upon the board, and I won't go through all of those. But let's talk about one study very briefly that I think is significant. Professor Tracy Birch at Northwestern University did a study. There are other people who've done studies on skin color. There is a bias in this country in favor of light complexion and conversely against dark complexion. And this study shows that people who are light-skinned on average will make higher wages than those who are of darker complexion. Now, we don't have the study in here based on, I guess, South Asians, but looking at the Caucasians and African Americans, and then looking at the scale of the color scale for African Americans, that holds true. Also in the area of criminal justice, people who are dark complected on average tend to be sentenced more harshly than those who are light complected. The study I was going to tell you about earlier was conducted by Professor Tracy Birch at Northwestern University on a prison population in the state of Georgia. And she looked at people who were charged with similar crimes, and in Georgia, they classified not only on race, but they also do these sub-classifications. I don't know whether it's something like, vanilla, mocha, dark, I don't know. But anyway, they do it. So she found that people who were African Americans who were on the lighter scale of the complexion chart was centered similarly to those whites, and those who were on the darker end were sentenced more harshly. Now, we can say a lot of things about a lot of entities, and I know we have the executive, legislative, and judicial branch represented. But when we talk about sentencing, that is squarely on us, the judges. We can't say the police, can't say the correctional officials. That's on us because we're the only ones who sentence. Prosecutors may make recommendations, but we sentence. So I think that's interesting. So up here now we have a chart on the disproportionality of Florida incarceration. And you'll see the percentages. In this chart, whites are underrepresented in the criminal justice or the prison population, and African Americans are overrepresented. And you can see the areas in between. So you know your statistics better than me.
So I think that what we want you to take away from this really brief sort of glimpse of manifestations of differences in criminal justice is that there's no really good explanation for them. If we are all people of good faith making our decisions in good faith, which I believe us to be, just like I believe teachers in education to be mostly making decisions in good faith for our children. So if that's all true, then how is it we come out with the disproportionalities you just saw in the prison population, and they're the same in the school population, they're the same all on the school to prison pipeline? What explains it? So if we're not racist, if we're not sexist, if we're not ableists, if we're not these kinds of things, how can we explain those manifestations, which have been with us for a very long time, through lots of task forces, lots of blue ribbon studies, lots of work, and lots of good intentions? So it's the new research that on implicit bias that helps us answer that riddle, and the idea that our brains are not thinking always consciously the way we believe they are. So here's the law professor to tell you to forget everything you learned in law school about thinking like a lawyer. Just forget that for the next 45 minutes, okay? I want you to just let that go, because what we're talking about now is not that logical, analytical piece of thinking that we so wanted you to learn and that you learned so well, but about the part of our brains that is not part of that. So we're going to do a few things to help you rethink thinking. So hopefully I can get this one to work.
You're going to count how many times the player's wearing the white?
Yeah, but it's not playing. Oh, I am so sorry. I did spend 2.5 hours here this morning getting these videos to play. So let me just share with you that I'm disappointed that they can't, and now ask you to please join me in this little imagination exercise. And please agree later to go home and try this. So how this works is these players pass the ball, and you all dutifully count. Have some of you seen this before? Yes. Yeah, okay. So you all dutifully count, and at the end, you all report into me that 16 people, there were 16 passes. And you're all feeling very good because you did the assignment. And then the speaker asks you whether you saw the gorilla. So in the middle of this passing, the gorilla comes through, and about half the people don't see it, the gorilla. So I've done this a lot of times, and I usually don't see the gorilla, even though I'm looking for it. So why is that? Because we all follow instructions. We all do as we're told. That's what we learned. So we're counting those passes, and we miss something pretty significant, a gorilla in the middle of a basketball game, right? So that's because our brains are focused in one place and not another. So we're going to try another version of this. Hang on. Okay, what do you see now? How many circles do you see?
How many see at least 2? Okay. All right. How many see 6? Okay, only one person.
I'm helping you now.
Oh.
Okay. So you saw the circles, right? So there are 16 circles, but you didn't see them at first, right? So why didn't you? because your brain's got a pattern for a door, and that pattern isn't about circles.
Okay, hang on a second. Take them off again, Sarah. Okay, so now is there anybody who can't see the circle now? Is there anybody who still can't see the circle? Okay, so you have a couple people who still can't see a circle. And I was one of those this morning, so I'm with you. She had to color them in for me to see the circles.
Okay, so what is this about? It's about our focus, right? When we told you, I'm sorry, it didn't work, but we told you to count the passes, you were focused on counting the passes. When we didn't tell you really anything about what looks like a door, you didn't see the circles. But most of you, when we started showing you where the circles were and focused on the content and the focus of those circles, you got it. So this is what implicit bias is about. It's there. It's about things that are very accessible and about things which are not very accessible. So things become accessible when we tell you, right? Or when you tell yourself to be focusing on them. So you saw the circles when you figured out to focus on them. So it's sort of fun, right? But it does have real world consequences, and we want to talk about some of that. Again, we've already talked about the manifestations of it. So
and let me just say that often we use the terms unconscious and implicit interchangeably, but I think if you think about this as unconscious rather than intentional or explicit, then I think people can kind of grasp that concept more. It's one of the things that happens, oftentimes when you talk about implicit bias, there's a pushback, as Professor Redfield said, because people are saying, you're saying that I'm prejudiced, or you're saying that I'm a racist, or you're saying that I'm a sexist or an ageist. No, we're saying that your brain, that processing in your brain is working and you're unaware of it. You're not conscious of it. It is unconscious.
So that was the riddle. If we're not all is, what is the answer? And the answer from the scientists, from the research people, not from Bernice and I, from the scientists who do this research all the time, is that it comes from our implicit or unconscious orientation to things. And so I just mentioned one thing to you. This research is relatively new. The Dr. Greenwald at the University of Washington, who started this with his colleague Mazrin Banaji only 25 years ago. So the idea that this research telling about us unconscious thinking is relatively new has taken time and leadership, such as that we told you about with Hilarie in the section of litigation, to get us to focus on the answer.
So there you will see the definitions between explicit and implicit. And it seems to me that we have skipped over a slide, or either I got mine out of order, because I want to go back for just a second. And Sarah, did you skip over the how do we report it slide? No, you didn't. I just got mine out of order. But anyway, go ahead.
So these are the definitions we've already told you. Some of it is what we learn from the world around us. We don't even know we're learning it, but it's part of the way we approach things unconsciously. And the rest is what we learn and what we consciously say. So as some of the scientists put it, the identifying feature is that it's not introspectively known to us. So I'm responding to you implicitly. Without, oh, you're wonderful. No, you're wonderful. Without really doing just as Hilarie described the motorcycle rider, I'm just responding because all I know is what I see. That'll be my implicit response to you. But then I'm going to ask you a few questions. We're going to get to know each other a little bit. Then I will have a more specific understanding of who you are. After lunch, I'm going to do this, okay? Okay. So, all right. So we're going to just try a few of these out. So what kind of bias is this? I use this slide other places, but here I am in Florida. So the Miami police play Black Monopoly. Black Monopoly is every square says go to jail. You remember this story? Oh, you're all pretending you don't know about this story. Okay, great. You never heard this story. Okay, so let's just pretend this story happened where I'm from in Maine. What kind of bias is this? Explicit, right? Very clear. Even if it didn't have, I don't know, I read it in the newspaper. Okay. Okay. Maybe it's not true, but it's a good example, everybody, if it were true. All right, so how about this one? I tell my human resources person I am an equal opportunity employer, and I really mean it. But somehow I end up hiring more men, especially white men. Oh, because they're better qualified. So what kind of bias is this? Implicit, yeah, because really they're not better qualified. And so this is, do some of you think they are? Oh, no. Okay, so this is something that's studied and studied
I have
and
no
studied.
comment on that one.
Okay, I'm not going there anymore.
Your bias is showing.
My bias is showing, okay. And let it show. Okay, so there's lots of studies on this about the men and the women, and you get a job or you don't get a job based on the name on your resume. So if your name is Greg, you're going to get called, you're going to get an interview. If your name is Jamal, too bad for you. And you can see in this graph that the taller yellow and greens, those are the white folks who get interviews. And they get interviews even when they are less qualified than Jamal. Okay, so this is documented and documented and documented all over the world. So we're going to try one more. You're in a wheelchair and talk louder. What kind of bias would that be? Implicit, yeah. And I'm here to tell you this is absolutely true. So I have a son who was in a wheelchair for 3 or 4 years, and everywhere we went, my daughter was pulling on my sleeve saying, "Mom, why are they yelling at Alex?" Right? So implicitly, people were saying, this boy is handicapped, so he's very handicapped. He's handicapped in a lot of ways. Not true. I'm his mother. Of course I don't think it's true, but not true. So those are all biases.
And what about the Asian person who speaks, and people say, "Oh, you speak very good English," and he says, "Well, I was born in Miami." But he just has Asian features, and so implicitly we look at somebody who may be Asian or whatever, and we assume that that English is not their first language. Okay, so how did we? What was the old way of measuring bias? And all of us who were lawyers or are lawyers, we did this especially in jury selection. We would ask, and people would tell you, honestly, I'm not biased. People, when I presided in the trial court, jury selection was always interesting because people would come up and say, "Can you be fair and impartial?" And we judges did that, and people said, "Of course I can be fair and impartial." And if you were trying to get somebody stricken from the jury, you could be very frustrated if you came back and pressed the judge about moving that person, saying you'd evidence some form of bias, and usually the judge would say, would maybe ask them the question again just to confirm and assure that person can be fair and impartial. And then they would say, "Okay, that person is qualified." But let me give you this hypothetical, or this example rather. And Sandy, you can just take a little mental vacation because you've heard this one before, but I was presiding over a drug trial, and the prosecutor asked his questions. I had asked mine earlier, and the defense attorney stood up and said, "How many of you know what a drug dealer looks like? Raise your hand." And all of these hands went up. And then she stopped. Remember the word that Hilarie used earlier, stereotypes? Well, she just kind of left it there for a moment. And you could see the hands slowly come down as people realized what they were saying by their actions. Because over at the defense counsel table was a young African-American man who looked like he stepped right out of central casting. And you have to ask yourself, how can that person be accorded the presumption of innocence when we, the jury, know what a drug dealer looks like, and he looks just like you? So that gave her an opportunity to unpack that. But that's once again, you see, stereotypes and implicit biases are all bound up together. And that was one of those examples. So think about that when you're going through this old way of trying to uncover biases and by asking people to self-report. You're not going to get much. So how do we do it now? Well, fortunately, we have a new tool, the implicit association test, that measures or that correlates response times to categories like good and evil, African American and Caucasian, and other things. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But that test was developed by Professor Anthony Greenwald and Professor Banaji.
Banaji, yep.
Yes, okay.
So we'd like to do a little exercise with you. Would you all just move your plates front a little so you have room to clap on the table? Okay, thanks. So there's going to appear a word or a picture in the middle of the screen. And if the word goes with the categories on the right, I want you to clap. And the categories on your left, I want you to hit the table. So let's practice which is love. Oh, you're all very good. Very good. Okay. Everybody understands the instruction. I think you thought it was going to be harder than this, right? Okay, you wait. All right, so everyone understands the instructions, what you're going to do. Match the box to the table, hitting, or to clapping, based on the category. Everybody's with me, right? Okay, go. Oh, sorry. Okay. I wouldn't say you all got it perfectly. It's supposed to be fast. I know you think I don't know what I'm doing, but it's supposed to be fast. It's not to give, it's for your quick reaction, your unthinking reaction, your unconscious reaction, and you're struggling, but you just wait. Okay, so now the categories are changed. Instead of good and bad, now if it's a picture or a word associated with white American, hit the table, black American, clap. Same instructions, different categories. You ready? Hey, you did pretty good on that one.
Yeah, that was good.
Okay, now we're doing it again, but now they're double categories, right? White American or good, black American or bad. Okay, or, remember the ors. I know you're all lawyers and judges, you got that, or, okay? All right. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that was a little harder. There were fewer to get your momentum going, but it was a little bit harder. And now here's the last set. The categories have changed again. You remember your instructions, right? All right, you ready? Okay, gotcha, right? You could all hear it. You could all hear it went slower as we got to the last category. It was pretty easy to get good and bad. You were all doing a really good job getting it. But as we got to the last category, it got slower. So this is an in-person, 3-year-old level version of, clap your hands, bang the table version of the implicit association test, which is most often taken online. So this is your first homework assignment. How many of you have taken the implicit association test? Great. The rest of you, go take one.
Okay, so how many of you have taken more than one? Because they're covered so many categories. Okay, so see, only a few of you have taken more than one. If you're going to take it, I would suggest that if you haven't taken it, don't start with the race test. Perhaps do gender, perhaps do weight, age, disabilities. But do several of them. Judge Mark Bennett, a district court judge in Iowa, talks about his experience with the IAT. He tells people on the front end that he's a white male in Iowa. He said he was raised by an African-American woman because his mother passed when he was very young. He had been a civil rights lawyer. He'd worked with African-Americans and I think Native people for a long time.
And let's just say he thought of himself as a very liberal white guy,
open.
right?
So he took the test, and it showed that he had a bias, a slight preference for Caucasians. And he said, well, the test has got to be wrong because that's just inconsistent with his values and with his self-perception. So he took it again, and he still came out with that same preference. And so he started at that time doing a lot of research and trying to understand the test. He's now one of the most prolific writers in this area, and he's concluded that the test is absolutely valid. There's a lot of literature coming out now where people are challenging this, and a lot of the challenge is, I think, people looking at implicit bias, and in their mind, they're saying, the people who write about this are trying to say that this is evidence of intent to discriminate. This is not an intent to discriminate. Now, discrimination may flow from it, but this is not the employment law, discrimination science.
So I urge you all to go take some of these tests if you haven't taken any, and take another one if you've taken one already. I tell you that I take them. I've worked since I was 14 years old. And when I take the test about women and careers compared to women and families, I do have 2 children, but women and families, I come out dead even on whether I have a preference for women who work or women who stay home with their families. And I really want to come out, with a preference for women who work. So what do I take away from this, and what do I think you should take away from it? Not all the correlations, not that it's going to predict your behavior, none of that, just an awareness. Just an awareness that you might be reacting this way without your intention. And I'll give you just one quick story about this. In my class, I had my research assistant count who I called on first. This is a pretty easy method of accountability, right? Someone counts. And I called on the white men first. Now, this was in New Hampshire, and there weren't very many people of color. So let's just say I called on the men first. And why did I do that when I reflected on it? Well, they sat right in front of me. They were this group right here. They always had their hands up, and they were always talking before I even said anything. Right? And so for me, that was kind of tough to admit that I wasn't recognizing the women in the room. But it was fixable. I just counted to 5. I told them they couldn't talk yet, and I counted to 5 before I saw some other hands go up. But I tell you that because that's what I think this is about. It's about awareness and making it fit into your own life. It's not about blame. It's not about what you'll do. It's just being more aware.
And along those same lines, if you look at the American Bar Association website, there are some videos of training for judges, training for prosecutors, and training for defense attorneys. But on the training for judges, there's a judge, I believe, from Maryland, an African-American judge who tells a story that he was in a criminal court and he sentenced a white male to prison. And at some time during that, you may have been on this task force, but at sometimes during this person's incarceration, the prisoner wrote the judge a letter and said, I believe that you discriminated against me based on the fact that I'm a white male. And, the judge was kind of put off a little bit by that. So he went back and did sort of an audit of his sentences. And he said he was very embarrassed and shocked when he learned that the judge, had been harsher on African-American males than he had been on others. And he says, he phrases it, I had committed the greater sin of being more biased against people of my own race. And there is a lot of literature about the perception of African-American males as more criminal. And remember, again, the study about the darker the complexion, the more prone to criminality. So, or that more people are viewed, as criminals. And so that was an eye-opener for him. And so he started then to become aware and sort of look at what factors he was considering in sentencing to try and mitigate that bias. And, finding out you got it is one thing, as we all know we have it. What you do in response to that or how you attempt to de-bias is another, and we'll get to that. So what does the IAT measure? Well, it measures accessibility of concepts. It tests, flower good, African American bad. It measures those things. It measures response time. And I was worried that because I'm not terribly good on the computer, that my response time would be slower, measuring my lack of facility with the computer rather than my responses. But, maybe I was just rationalizing. I don't know. It also measures your system 1 and system 2 thinking, and it reflects schemas and preferences or bias.
So I'll just interrupt to say that there is a lot of research that you hit 2 keys to do this test. There's a lot of research that's not the reason you get the score you get. I'm sorry, Judge.
No, I thought that. I didn't say I ended up there.
There's a lot of research validating the actual methodology of the test.
Well,
okay.
And I thought that, but let me just tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, I came out without without having an appreciable bias for any group. So it's probably because I'm a judge.
Oh, jeez. Did you all hear that? She didn't rehearse that line ahead of time, I'm telling you. So this is just a quick slide that shows you how most people test. So when you do the test online, at the end you get a message that says, so of all the people who've taken this test, 71% prefer white over black. And so you get your own message. And this is just a quick summary. It doesn't surprise me to see that most of us prefer flowers over insects. So again, it's measuring our response time without our intent. So I'm just going to show you one little exercise. So it's measuring our response time, our implicit response to a prime. So when you saw that black face, you were primed. When you saw that word, you were primed. So this is a prime from an office where you had to pay for your own coffee. You all have offices like this? Some of you are shaking your heads. Some places the coffee is apparently free. I don't know. Okay, so some weeks there was this sign. It was just a poster, right? There was this poster that says, please leave money for coffee. Other weeks, there was this sign, human eyes. Please leave, the message is the same, please leave money for coffee. There's nobody standing there watching you most of the time, get your coffee and leaving money or not leaving money. But on the weeks that the flowers were up, fewer people and less money. So, okay, posters are power, I guess, So here we have a prime that's just sort of neutral flowers, or we have a prime of a human face as if it might be watching you. And you are responding, I am sure unconsciously, you are not saying, I'm leaving 75 cents because the eyes poster's up. You're not. So this is an example of how primes work. And here is the bad news for everyone in this room. It does not matter how smart you are. I know this is hard to swallow, okay? So all of the research on this, including a good deal of research done by Professor Raklinsky from Cornell with judges, shows that judges, just like the rest of us, are implicitly biased. The good news is it shows also that they can be made aware and do reflect that in their decisions. So that's a sort of good news, bad news. But just because you're smart, do not leave this room saying, oh, she's only talking about them, right? This is not Garrison Keillor. Everybody's better than 100%, right? Okay. So now we're going to try one more exercise. What do you see here?
Louder.
Florida. Some people said Florida. How many of you think you see Florida? Okay, what else?
Somebody.
Yes, some of you said gun.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is part of a research experiment done by Professor Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a leading scholar in this. And she showed people a continuing sequence of these frames, and each one became
Before
more
you go to the
clear.
next one.
Oh.
Okay, so in that first one, how many of you saw an embryo? Okay, well.
You stand alone. Okay. So what she did was she showed people a developing sequence of these frames with picture. I think there were 20, some 40, I guess, altogether, until at the end, everyone saw a gun, right? And then she interspersed them with primes. So after the first figure, you saw a prime of a black face or a white face, depending on the research structure. And here's what she found out. So the prime, the black prime, brought a gun to mind, and the guns brought blacks to mind in a later experience. But when you look at it, they were ambiguous. A few of you got gun right away, but not very many. And that would be typical of her research because the first picture, was ambiguous. But as you were primed, you identified things as a gun or not. And so with a white prime, you found the gun much later in the sequence than with a black prime. Yeah.
And one of the reasons that this is so important.
Okay. Yeah, okay. Oh, white face. So remember these pictures?
So you can flash a picture
after
in a
this
millisecond.
Okay, I'm going to fix this slide for next time. After this picture, she would show you a picture of a white face. Then she would show you another picture. Then she would show you another picture. So, and the faces were interspersed with the developing pictures of the guns. And so what she was measuring was how quickly you called it a gun. How many frames it took you to call it a gun. Okay?
And one of the other areas where it's not an ambiguous situation, but if you go on the computer, you can look at the shooter bias test. And there are people holding different objects, and you're supposed to shoot when the person is holding a gun and not shoot when the person is holding a cell phone or a can of Pepsi or whatever. And those, how you make the associations, sometimes there are the association with the faces will affect your reaction time on that. Also, Sarah talked about ambiguity. And in areas of ambiguity is where we have sort of the greatest potential for implicit bias to manifest, or for our decisions to be based in part on that. So we have to be really careful. And when you do that priming with that, I think it really demonstrates it.
So just think about this 1 second before we leave this slide. If this is how you are perceiving a person with something that could be a gun, you are less likely to respond correctly to the white person with a gun and less likely to respond to the black person without a gun. So this really goes both ways. So we're going to do one more exercise and then move on from this. Here's your job. Read the words by reading the color. So read across, red, green, blue.
Yeah,
everybody
and we're supposed
go
to go
now.
at the same time. So let's
1,
go.
2, 3, go. Red,
Green, blue, yellow, pink, orange, blue.
okay, you're doing great. You can stop now.
Brilliant.
Okay. But it's not easy for the next one, right? I've been here long enough. You got this? Yeah. Okay. Okay, I want you to do the same thing, only this time read the font color, starting again with green. Okay, go. Okay, guys, you're not doing so well, are you?
Okay, so we have a bunch of people in here who are law trained. Why are you having trouble with this?
Because you all know how to read.
We don't have anybody in here with visual impairments, nor do we have anyone here who can't read. So why are we having trouble?
So it's almost
It's
as
that
if
association.
you can't do anything but follow the prime, right? Or if you can, you have to really slow down and bring your conscious mind to bear on saying green when the word is really red. So this is an old test from the 1930s, and still nobody can do it, right? Or not groups like us anyway.
It's called the Stroop test if you want to go online and try to do it.
So we're just going to review what we've said so far here. Bernice, are you going to do this? Or?
We've talked about schemas, and there can be many schemas. We're talking about unsought cultural expertise condensed into stereotypes and attitudes. And, some of these things reflect on race, height, social class, religion, our own groups. And I just want to tell you, the literature says that in this country, at least, we prefer people with height. We prefer tall people over short people. If you think about the last several presidents, we have not had a president under 6 feet since Jimmy Carter. And I think he was like 5'10" or 11 or something like that. But we prefer height. We associate power with that height. And we know that we have many millions of people here in all kinds of groups. And there are a lot of stereotypes and schemas that we associate with those groups. Look, for example, at the next slide.
We just have to get a little chuckle on this one.
Okay,
right?
And I can't read it. So
I don't see liking trucks as a boy thing. I see it as a liking trucks thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just sort of a try to capture in a cartoon the idea that we're trying to convey to you, that without conscious thought, you do see it as a boy thing. Okay, so these are things absorbed from the world around us.
So when you think about a judge, if you go and Google judges, what might you get? But before you show the video, let me just tell you that my first judicial position was as an elected judge in Memphis, Tennessee. And I went to have my campaign messages, my TV, radio ads produced. And I had an appointment for 4 o'clock. So I got there about 10 of 4, presented myself with my name and said that I was here to have my radio slot produced. And they told me to have a seat. And I sat, and I sat, and I sat. Now the room had a 3/4 length partition, and there were 2 young white females at the desk. And about 4:15, they started to kind of complain a little bit and said, we only have one more to do, and it's some Bernice Donald, and I'm not sure where she is, but she's not here by 4:30, that's it. And I stepped around the partition again and I said, excuse me, I'm Bernice Donald, and I'm here. Now, for visual imagery, back then, I was probably about 40 pounds lighter than I am now. So I said, excuse me, I'm Bernice Donald, and I'm here. And they went, you're Bernice Donald? And I said, yes. The woman said to me without missing a beat, you don't look like a judge. And I said, what's a judge supposed to look like? She said, I don't know, but you don't look like one. And there was no malice in that. What she was responding to were the stereotypes of judges at that time. They were male, they were white, and they were older. Go with our slide. So if you Google judges, you'll get this wonderful picture. Well, you won't get some of those, but anyway, what do judges look like? And if you look at the male images up there, for a long time, many of the judges were white males. We do have others now. If you Google.
So this is what you
categories.
get your first 20 pictures of. If you look at Bing images,
Yes.
these are the pictures you get for your first 20.
Yes. Did we do the beautiful judges?
Yeah, we're going to.
Okay.
Well, no. So you'll see there's only one woman down in the corner here, but you can make some other choices on big images. So we chose female judges,
Okay.
and this is what we get. And then, just like you could make some choices for that, there are also choices you can make for female judges. So please remember that when we saw the choices from the first judges, there was no equivalent to beautiful judges. There was no handsome judges for men.
We tried to find those, but you know.
So here's what, so this is what our culture around us, remember this absorbing of stereotypes from what's around us? This is what we're seeing, and this is what the stereotypes are. So think about it if you're asked to evaluate a vote on a judge. What are you thinking? What are the other responders thinking? Are they thinking that Bernice Donald doesn't look like a judge? Well, maybe then.
Yeah.
Maybe now.
But now, just average citizens say, well, if you're a judge, why aren't you on TV? Because now we've started to link judges with TV images. So you must not be a real judge, you're not on TV. So I'm thinking, no, it's kind of just the opposite. Those are.
Okay, so we're going to try one more category that's not judges, all right? So how would you categorize this person? Anybody? Not hard. Come on, no tricks here. White? Male? Well-educated. Some of you said scientist. Absolutely correct. He's a Stanford professor, chair of the Department of Neurobiology. So far, probably consistent with what you are all saying or thinking and not saying. Okay. So what else do we know about him? Anything? He does look happy? Okay. So not too much, right? Can't tell too much more from just this picture. So how do you think he does when he's presenting somewhere? Do you think he's a good presenter? How many of you think he's a good presenter? A few. How many of you think he's a bad presenter? Whoa, a few. Okay, so, all right. So here's the thing.
Claudia thinks he's a bad presenter.
Here's the thing. So I'm a professor. I give a lot of talks, and as I'm leaving the room, I'm always eavesdropping on what people are saying behind me, right? I'm always trying to hear whether they're saying, oh, wasn't she great? Or did you see how she couldn't, whatever it is, I'm eavesdropping. And I'm really paying attention, right? So Dr. Bars tells this story about leaving a presentation, eavesdropping on the people behind him, saying, wasn't Ben great? Didn't he give such a great presentation? He's so much better than his sister, Barbara. Do any of you get this yet? Okay, so. There is no sister, Barbara. So Ben Bars is transgendered from Barbara Bars. So from the time he gave his talk as Barbara till the time he gave his talk as Ben, you can go ahead and believe he became smarter, a better presenter, more articulate, or you can go ahead and believe that he was being judged on his gender, implicitly, if not explicitly. I personally believe the latter. And he has gone on to talk about this. He died last year, but during his career, he talked about this and wrote about this. And I'll share with you the one thing he said that was the most significant thing he noticed when he went from being Barbara to Ben and being at meetings and conferences. Anyone want to guess?
He didn't get interrupted.
Exactly. When he was Ben, he did not get interrupted. When he was Barbara, he was always interrupted. So this to me is sort of for those who are feeling a little maybe skeptical about whether we have implicit biases, I think this one tells us. So we're going to just spend just a couple seconds talking about the ideas of groups and how we're influenced by those ideas.
Okay, so I think I have put those, well, we're all a part of a group. And I've lost my slide for that, but so we're all part of a culture group. Actually, we're part of a lot of different groups. And if we had time and we were in a classroom setting, we might give you some interlocking circles, and you might identify all the ways that you connect. But as Hilarie said earlier, we all tend to prefer people who are in our group, and that group identity influences our values and our reactions and our decisions. The next slide. So we prefer our own, no matter how we define our own. And in order to debias, we need to learn to individuate, look at people as people, look at the individual, and not assign the group characteristics to every individual. We need to assume good. And I will tell you, I participated in a World Bank program a number of years ago that addressed the question of whether people are basically good or basically evil. And just like seeing the embryo in the image before,
are you going to make us answer that?
I know. No. But we do need to assume good, and then we need to do good also. What's out is, we don't want to not distinguish, because that influences these biases. We don't want to misattribute. Just assume that because the person is male, they're a good presenter, and because they're female, they're not a good presenter. Our strong conclusion is that in present-day America, discrimination results more from who we help rather than who we choose to harm. And so we want to be mindful of that our actions are different with our in-groups and our out-groups.
So I think it's significant to think about with whatever decision you're making, whatever communication you're having, it's likely to be good for someone, but not good for someone else. So when you're helping someone, you're not certainly intending to hurt the other person, but it's important to remember that there are helping and not helping, and they do have effects.
And we're not saying don't help. We're just saying
just be conscious of what happens.
You're doing and the counteractions.
So this is the last piece of our explication on implicit bias definitions and groups. And this is short but sweet set of 2 slides about micro messages. So I want you to all just cast your minds back to when you came in this room and who you spoke to and who you sat down next to and who you gave a hug to and who you shook hands with. And you were conveying a small message to everyone around you when you were doing that. And if you are an important person, I'm sure everyone in this room qualifies as this, but if you're an important person, you were really conveying that message, and who you acknowledged was a significant message to other people that maybe they should try to acknowledge that person. These are called micro messages. They're not actionable. They're not going to be a lawsuit about discrimination, but they do accumulate. And so I show you this cartoon as explanation of the whole concept. That's an excellent suggestion, Ms. Triggs. Perhaps one of the men here would like to make it. So you all laugh, and every time I've shown this cartoon, everyone chuckles. But here's the thing, it's not so funny, and it's real today in 2018, as it was when it was written in 1985. So this is a sort of quick encapsulation of micro messages, but there are many, and they're everywhere. And they accumulate, and they're contagious, and they're self-perpetuating. So when we call them micro, it's a little bit off. They're not so small after all when they start to accumulate. So I need to keep in mind the implicit bias definitions, the groups, and the micro messages as we start to talk a little bit about disrupting bias.
Okay. And before we get into the disruption, I wanna give one more real life example of the helping harming, because we have people across the criminal justice system here. In Memphis, in the Western District of Tennessee, there are a lot of prosecutions for felons in possession of ammunition or firearms. And as you know, the prosecutors charge, and there are a lot of consequences that flow from how we charge. Sometimes there can be different charging patterns in the same office. On this particular day, on my 9 o'clock docket, I had standing before me an African-American man who was charged with being a felon in possession of a firearm. There were 8 individual counts in that indictment. And those of you who practice federally know that there is, or at least when I was on the court, was a $100 special assessment for every count. And all of these convictions, can influence things down the road. So this man pled guilty to all 8 counts. And after going through all of the colloquy, I accepted his plea. In the afternoon, I was back on the bench taking another plea. There was a young white male standing before me in a 2-count indictment. Count 1 charged possession of stolen weapons, in parentheses, 8 weapons. Count 2 was felon in possession of a firearm, in parentheses, 8 weapons. And so I said to the assistant U.S. attorney, I said, wait a minute, didn't we have a case this morning where the person had 8 weapons and they were charged? Each weapon was in a separate count. Why do we now have all 8 subsumed in 1 count? Because the stolen weapons charge was being dismissed as a part of the plea negotiation. And the person said to me, well, I don't know. I said, look, we should not have different charging patterns coming out of the same office. That is why certain communities believe that they cannot get justice in the court system. And so I spoke to called down the U.S. attorney to address the issue. But oftentimes, and I will tell you that we didn't take that plea right then and there, but I did make the U.S. attorney aware, because even though you have different deputies executing functions, the community doesn't see that necessarily as an individual attorney executing an executive function. They look at what's coming out of that office, the office in the Western District of Tennessee, and there may not have been an intent to harm or help, but that was the result on the ground. This person, if you look at who's going to be viewed on the paper as more criminal, it's going to be that person that had 8 convictions for a weapon. That person is going to look immensely more dangerous than the one who had the 1 count of conviction. So that's one of those situations where you can see that helping harming thing. Sarah?
So I encourage you to ask yourself, when you're helping someone, if you're harming someone else. And not that you intend to harm someone else, but that just 2-minute, 1 minute maybe, even reflection, just helps you get some perspective here. And that's what this is all about. That's what disrupting bias is all about. It's having perspective, being mindful. So when we do training, which is longer than this presentation, this is our grid. And we talk about each of these squares as a way to interrupt implicit bias and to pay attention. If you read through them, you'll see they all are really summarized by be bothered, be mindful. But they're broken down in order to give people some tools to work with.
And you keep talking, I'm going to get the sheets and distribute these.
Oh, okay. So before we get into them, I start with just a quick reminder, why bother? And really the judge was supposed to say this slide because she has her own personal story. But anyway, why bother? Because it could save your mother's life. So the medical profession is very clear that the treatment it prescribes, the data is really clear, is different for white men and women of any color. So you're more likely to get serious intervention in heart when you present heart issues if you're a white man than if you're not. So that's one reason. The second one, of course, in this group, we have to use this reason because the American legal system depends on the perception, if not the reality, hopefully both, of justice.
Yeah. We tell people that the system is fair and unbiased, and that's what people expect, but what people perceive might be totally different. I will tell you that about 60 years ago, an organization called the National Conference of Christians and Jews did a survey eliciting people's perception of whether the justice system was fair or whether they could receive a fair outcome. Now, they only measured 4 groups. And what they found in that measurement was that African Americans, by and large, felt like whether it was civil or criminal court, they could not reasonably expect a fair outcome. The statistic for Latinos was a little bit higher, but the people who felt the most confident that they could get a fair outcome were Caucasians or whites. Now, that survey did not measure Native Americans. They found that group to be statistically insignificant. But the RAND Corporation did a similar study within the last decade, and not much had changed in terms of people's perception of whether or not they would be treated fairly by the justice system. Now, that is a problem for all of us. That is an indictment against all of us who are stakeholders in that system. But it's, in this instance, perception sometimes becomes reality. Because if people perceive that they're not going to be treated fairly, that they're not going to get a fair and unbiased outcome, then they are less likely to voluntarily participate in the system, and they're much less likely to believe that the process or the outcome is one that they can accept.
And I think the bad news for all of us is this is true today. The Pew Research Center work last year shows exactly, not to the decimal point, but the same general pattern of perception of justice. So there's one more. Why bother impacts our careers, it impacts the decisions we make, and I'm going to give you a few what I call seeing examples. So you see what you expect. I'm skipping this one because we've already talked about it.
Right.
When the judge told you about the criminal defendant. So you see what you expect. But what you see also impacts you. So if you can't see the cartoon, it's the subject of today's discussion is why there are no women on this panel, all men. So when you see a panel that is not diverse, you get a message, right? And when you see a bench that's not diverse, when you see a group of attorneys who aren't diverse, you get a message. And it impacts you, especially if you are not one of the included group, right? If you are one of the marginalized group. So that's the next one. And the next piece I want to tell you is that not everyone sees things the same way. So I don't have much hope for my video, but yeah. Okay, so this is a video from the court case, Scott versus Harris. Some of you probably know it way better than I do. It was a high-speed chase, and a deputy rammed the guy off the road at the end of the high-speed chase, and the guy was paralyzed. And this video, which you can find online, was part of the record before the court. And as the court tried to decide whether it was clear that there was an actual imminent threat the way this guy was driving. So we all know how many judges are on the court. 8 of them agreed that this was an actual imminent threat and ruled for the deputy. But Justice Stevens did not. So they all saw the exact same video, One judge saw something different. And Justice Breyer felt so strongly about what he saw that he puts this in his opinion. Well, what am I supposed to do? I saw it. But one justice did not see it. And so some law professors, of course, went around the country showing this video to people. It was a big sample and asking them what they saw. So they did not 100% agree with 8 justices of the Supreme Court. The split was closer to 25-75, and significantly for, I think, the purposes of lawyers and judges understanding what makes good evidence, they split on race and gender lines. So the people who didn't see it the way 8 Supreme Court justices saw it were more likely to be women, more likely to be people of color. So this is all biases that are playing in what you see that, again, I give you an example of, and I hope you can see why you should bother in your own work. And then this one is just, I guess it's our favorite. Is it, Bernice?
I think it is. This is a writing sample. This was in a large law firm. A third-year associate developed a memo which was circulated to various partners, and the partners were diverse. They were to evaluate whether evaluate rather the quality and content of the memo. Now, some people received one where Thomas Meyer was an African American. Others received one where Thomas Meyer was a Caucasian. And as you might imagine, this was the same memo. It had the same errors. But when people thought that the writer was an African American, that person, the memo received a 3.2 on a 5-point scale, whereas it received a 4.1 on a 5-point scale when he was Caucasian. There were fewer spelling errors detected by the Caucasian Meyer than there were the African American. People made comments. The comments were more numerous and more critical when it was an African American. And some people said, I cannot believe we hired this person when the Thomas Meyer was the African American. And this, as I said before, the comments were more numerous and they were more critical, even when the reviewing partner was an African American or a woman. But it was the exact same memo with the exact same errors. And so that tells us again about the bias. You'll see that somebody, when the Meyer was white, said he was generally a good writer with a lot of potential. And on the other side, you see, I can't believe this guy went to NYU. He just doesn't measure up to our standards. But once again,
It must have been a legacy.
right. So you can see again the impact of bias and what we expect to see.
These folks were set
the
up.
quality product when the writer is the African American, but that's something we have to debunk.
So for those of you who are hiring clerks, who are hiring associates, who are hiring faculty, and you ask for writing samples, pay attention here, right? Pay attention to how critically, even if you're teaching your students, pay attention to how critically you're looking at that
We're
work
gonna
and
wrap
how
this up in
fairly.
5 minutes and then take your.
Yep,
We
there
got
we go.
10 minutes total. Go.
So this is our short summary. We're implicitly biased, we're influenced by it. Science has shown us that it's manifested in pretty much every disproportionality we see in society. It's most at play, and this is probably maybe one of the most significant points we're making, it's most at play in ambiguous and discretionary situations. So look, everyone, that's what we do all the time, right? We make decisions in ambiguous and discretionary situations. So that's really significant. It can be interrupted. To do so, we need to become aware of it. We need training to help us. This isn't training, remember? And there are evidence-based strategies that now, 25 years out, we are beginning to see are effective, and we all need to deliberate and practice. So that said, this is a summary of the strategies that are on the handout, which I think everyone has by now.
And these are debiasing techniques that you need to look at.
And what we'd like you to do is just chat with a couple or all of the people at your table and describe an experience you've had or were part of, that you saw it or you were part of it, that involved implicit bias, and think about whether any of these strategies might have been useful to you at the time.